All right, everybody. Thank you so much for making it today. This is another one of our additions to our Future Directions Forum 2022 programming. As I've mentioned in previous workshops and addresses, we decided this year to roll out the programming over the course of several months, as opposed to putting it all together in one set of virtual meeting days. And we'll actually have some announcements about Future Directions Forum 2023 tomorrow at our address. Dr. Mia Barnett is giving an address tomorrow on her work on lay health workers, model of service delivery, at 3 p.m. Eastern time. So we'll be doing some announcements about next year tomorrow. For today, I'm actually dedicating this time to deliver a workshop that on a topic that I very much enjoy talking about. Work regarding reviewing and editing, and this is a portion of our jobs that we all do after we've disseminated a few pieces of work, and a key component or a key piece of the hidden curriculum on these kinds of issues really revolves around, well, if I want to be involved in the leadership of the editorial boards of journals, how do I go about doing that? How do I get there? And so we're going to be spending about 90 minutes talking about all that. And so what I'll do, we'll do over the course of our time together today is we'll first start off sort of laying the sort of groundwork or contextualizing what are the key components of publishing in academic journals, and how we, as both readers of journals and as evaluators or reviewers for journals, how do we intersect with all the key components of the publication process. And then the remainder of our time together will be focused on trying to think about strategies for getting involved in journal leadership, with a specific emphasis on trying to figure out which strategies are reasonable or attainable across a variety of different career stages. And we'll go sort of step by step. Please feel free to ask questions whenever you wish, but I timed out the session, so there's plenty of time for questions and answers at the end. As with all my workshops, I always come bearing gifts. This is a QR code to a Dropbox folder that has a bunch of materials relevant to our discussion today. And the link to that Dropbox folder was just put in the chat right now. All right, so I'm going to spend some moments talking about how we link up together with academic journals and the entities that disseminate these journals and make it possible for them to be produced and distributed to scholars like us. This is a picture of me and a couple of my mentors, Dr. Alan Kasdan and Dr. Wendy Silverman, who are both at Yale University. This is actually a picture, the very first picture, where the three of us were all together in one room. I did my undergraduate training with Wendy Silverman, my graduate training with Dr. Alan Kasdan. This is actually a picture we took at the tail end of Dr. Kasdan's Festschrift, the ceremony we had back in 2018 when he was retiring. And I had my first exposure to journals and peer review while I was training in both of their laboratories, and in the context of my work with Wendy Silverman. She was actually editor of, at the time of my undergraduate training, was editor of the same journal that I edit now. And so a lot of us are sort of immersed in peer review at an early age, at an early time in our training, as undergraduates, as graduate students, as postdoctoral fellows. And that's important to sort of mention from the outset, because we all have connections to these experiences, and in the context of our own work, we have connections to these experiences in part because a lot of the people that our mentors cite, that we cited in our own formative work, that we cite now after years of doing work, are typically the same people that are oftentimes reviewing our own work, and vice versa for ourselves. And so obviously a lot of our initial experiences of peer review were on the end of, I'm consuming research, I'm producing research, I'm getting feedback about my research, and now the tables have turned. Now the idea is, you're here because you want to get some strategies, you get a sense of strategies you might initiate to become more involved in this process than you are right now. And the important thing to think about with regards to reviewing is that, like a lot of other industries, peer review in our context, in its ideal form, kind of serves as a quality control system. And it's a quality control system that looks a bit different like other systems in other industries. And so let's say, you're a company that makes appliances of some kind, like phones or refrigerators or what have you. There's a quality control process within those industries that's designed to catch things that, if not addressed during the production process, tangible, objective outcomes might manifest. Negative ones, like that fridge doesn't work the first time people plug it in. That phone burns a hole in your pocket because the battery overheats. So peer review in other industries oftentimes has a tangible negative outcome if you don't address key components that are instrumental in a product or whatever you're trying to produce doesn't function as intended. And peer review in the publishing space doesn't necessarily have those same kinds of tangible outcomes, because you can give a piece of advice to somebody and it might produce a better product than if you didn't give that piece of advice, but there's no guarantee in that. And there's usually a fair amount of subjectivity in the degree to which a comment that you make as a reviewer will demonstrably improve the final version of whatever you're giving feedback on. That said, this is a necessary infrastructure, and it's an infrastructure that has multiple moving parts. Any one of those parts, the publisher that distributes the journal, the society that might or may not own the journal. A lot of journals are owned by scholarly societies, and then they partner with publishers to distribute. Sometimes publishers both distribute and own the content. But that synergy among these different agents in the publication process is essential, for sustainability purposes. Each of us play a role, and if any of us backed out of it, in all likelihood, we wouldn't have the system we have now. So let's start with the publishers. In the publishers, for the grand majority of our outlets, like Taylor and Francis, like the American Psychological Association, like Elsevier, like Oxford University Press, like Cambridge, they provide material resources to ensure the sustainability of dissemination procedures within the context of our journals. And at most of these publishing houses, the academic journals and the leadership structures within them aren't populated by full-time employees at those publishers. There are some publishers like that, but many of the ones that you might submit to, have folks who are doing these kinds of, fulfilling these kinds of roles on a part-time or consultation basis. That's one of the ways in which publishers reconcile the notion that in-house, they might not have the necessary expertise to produce scholarly work in very specialized areas like clinical child and adolescent psychology or neuropsychology or neuroscience. And the way they sort of thread that needle, the way they sort of reconcile that, is by outsourcing this kind of work to people like us. And that relationship is possible for a few different reasons. One of the big reasons is that the people who are producing content for the journals also happen to be the ones that are primarily consuming that work as well. So you're putting it out there as an author. You're also reading it as a scholar in this larger community. So it looks a little different than, say, a recording artist, releasing an album or putting out a single, and maybe lots of people within your network might consume the music, but you're producing that music for an audience of people that goes well beyond those in your own space that do a lot of the same work that you do. In our case, there's a lot of overlap, not one-to-one, but a lot of overlap between who produces the content and who consumes it. And so that connectivity makes a big difference in our business. And then by extension, we have that connectivity between production and consumption of this content. But our relationships to that content aren't specific, or not typically specific, to an actual publisher. So to the degree that you're a quote unquote fan of a journal, of a source of content, you're probably not a fan of the publisher, but you're more a fan of the actual journal because you read that journal in graduate school. You remember reading papers in your upper division courses in undergrad. You maybe published your first paper in that journal or what have you. So the relationship we have is usually tenuous at best with the publisher and stronger by significant margins with the actual journals we consume. Now, this is all stuff that we know. These are all things that are sort of self-evident from our histories with the work that we consume, but it's useful to sort of contextualize it because it makes a big difference when sort of understanding our connections to the editorial boards of these journals. Now, on the surface, you might see an editorial board, look at the list of scholars, and you might ask yourself, well, obviously they're on those editorial boards because they're well known, they're productive, what have you. And those things at times are important, but what's really important with regards to people's membership on these editorial boards are twofold. One is, do they know their own area really well, so they have a layer of expertise that makes them well positioned to do work in that area. But beyond that, is that an area that the journal values to a sufficient extent that they want readers to know we care about this work, we disseminate this work. And so, and then on the part of contributors, if you submit your paper in a content area like this, we have the necessary expertise to give you a fair review. And so in that respect, these editorial boards, at least in my view, aren't just scientific documents. They're also documents that have a layer of morality to them. The journals care about these content areas to such an extent that they make space on their boards to represent those content areas with these scholars involved. And all of these different elements of our relationships to these journals are instrumental in thinking about why we would even be motivated to review a paper at any of those journals in the first place. For some of us, we might say yes to a review request or be involved in leadership for a journal because we say to ourselves, this is work that I have to consume anyway. Why not be involved in evaluating which pieces of work should be published in the journal? Years and years ago, I remember reading an the inaugural editorial written by Bob Sternberg when he took over as editor-in-chief of the Psychological Bulletin. And there's a moment in the editorial that really stuck out to me. Basically said that the Psychological Bulletin, which is a review journal published by the American Psychological Association, the way he saw it, he sort of thought of that journal as continuing education for psychology. So this notion that all of us as members of the community of scholars in psychology should treat the Psychological Bulletin as not only required reading, but how you stay up to date with a broad swath of the work in the field. So you receive a review request from Psychological Bulletin, you're most likely to say yes, because the work that comes out in that journal is impactful in a variety of different ways. And one of the ways it's impactful is that it kind of keeps us all up to date as to what's happening. And then we're also perhaps even motivated to contribute our expertise with the idea that, let's say in years past, you thought to yourself, work in that journal, didn't really cover the kind of work that I've consumed in my area of expertise, and I want to see more of that. Being involved in the review process helps increase the likelihood that the work that you value finds its way into the pages of the journal that you're reviewing. So how do you get there? How do you get to that review spot? One of the tough things with reviewing is this notion that there's no class in taking it. And the research that on sort of peer reviewed training is rather murky as to whether or not it has any demonstrable impact on reviewer behavior. I think part of the reason why that might be is that reviewers oftentimes learn how to do that work based on the kinds of reviews they were exposed to, but also in their earlier years of reviewing their first papers, particularly with senior faculty. A lot of us review our first paper almost as a co-review with a mentor of ours. My first review was a co-mentoring review with Dr. Mitch Prinstein, who was the editor of JCAP right before me. So in grad school back in 2004, he received a review invite and asked me if I could co-review it. That was my first review. Editorial boards change from editor to editor. The composition changes a whole lot, but there are a few common denominators, a few things that editors on average tend to look for among reviewers, and it's important to sort of keep these things in mind. Again, these will feel self-evident, but they also help us understand and contextualize what the rest of what we're going to be talking about today. One of the things that we all look for from the get-go is not only reviewers who are submitting things on time, but even with the pandemic, it's even hard to even get reviewers to say yes to reviews. And then even more rare is to have them turn something in that's of sufficient quality where an editor can make an informed decision. And so, at baseline, we're always looking for people who have this high degree of conscientiousness. And later on in the workshop, we'll actually talk a bit about specific things you can do to sort of get on editors' radar. And there's some materials in the Dropbox folder to help facilitate that. So conscientiousness, yes. And then you'd be surprised, or maybe not, depending on how many times you felt like the review process didn't give you much of a fair shake. But there's editors always are on the lookout for not only people who are conscientious, but also can deliver feedback to reviewers in constructive ways, even if it looks like the reviewer's own area of work might even conflict with some of the findings or some of the perspectives described in the paper that they're reviewing. And that's the mark of a really strong reviewer, somebody who can be constructive, even if it looks like that work conflicts in really important ways with what they do. And sometimes we'll get a review that seems on the surface unfair, and that really increases the likelihood that that's not the kind of person we ask to do more than one. Now, I mentioned before that editorial boards are composed of people that have expertise on topics. And what I didn't sort of unpack was what expertise actually means when it comes to seeking out reviewers. Because, from an editor standpoint, we're not trying to look for people that are, or at least a really good editor is not looking for a set of people that are out to say yes or no in unison on any one contribution that you're considering in terms of publication in that journal. Rather, you try to identify a set of reviewers that vary from each other in important ways in terms of areas of expertise. So in any one submission that we get, you look at the reviewers and ask yourself, okay, who's a really good content expert? Someone who knows that area really, really well. That person might know the content area really well, but is obviously not going to be immersed in every kind of way of doing research in that content area. They might know the area really well, but their work is their main work is within treatment studies. They don't know that much about longitudinal work. Maybe the paper includes an analytic technique that this content expert would have some idea about, but doesn't know it really well. So sometimes we'll pick out or identify a reviewer who doesn't know the content area really well, but knows that method really, really well. And then we might even think of a third kind of reviewer that doesn't know the method really well, doesn't know the content really well, but based on your own experience as an editor, that person does a really good job of understanding where findings fit in the larger literature. And because manuscript reviews are often kept kind of diffuse, we don't necessarily ask people, we want your comments on this part of the paper, and this part of the paper, and this part of the paper, and this part of the paper. No, actually, we kind of usually leave that free to vary so that the reviewer can provide comments specifically in the thing that they feel competent in delivering advice. And so in that respect, we hope to get a nice holistic impression of the paper. And if we do that, and we're identifying people who systematically vary from each other in their areas of competency or their areas of expertise, then what that also should translate to is people varying on the recommendations, on their on what kind of content they suggest revisions on their suggestions. There's lots of variation, and so we shouldn't necessarily expect in that scenario for people to agree with each other in content area or even over overall recommendations. And what that also means is that there's a lot of room for people to become reviewers, because oftentimes editors will seek out reviewers and members of their editorial board who vary on these lines. Content experts, yes. Methods experts, most definitely. People who know the field really well and can take a broad view of the field, most definitely as well. So what does that mean? Well, what that usually means is editors are looking for reviewers who already have demonstrated that they can do their own stuff and well, so, and I think about this in terms of like the airline safety on the plane, and they give you like the discussion about what happens if we lose cabin pressure. And what do they say? If the cabin pressure drops and the masks come, the oxygen masks come, for yours on first, before you help out your kid, before you help out a loved one who might need help themselves. And that's kind of the way that we think about reviewers. They've already given us an idea based on their own body of work that they can do that work well. That's not the same as I can also give good advice, but it's a necessary condition to be able to give that good advice. And so there's a lot of ways in which you can go about doing that. I mean, here's one way that editors know right away that a reviewer could be really good. If they put out a well-written review, a meta-analysis, a conceptual paper, a review paper in a decent journal that's well received by colleagues, that kind of like immediately stamps you as a person who knows who at least knows that area well. And so that's usually enough. It's not like, oh, you've published 20 papers, you can review now. It can be as easy as you've demonstrated this, so you know this content area really well because you've published this one paper that's wide ranging in scope. Now let's see if we can give advice to people in that same content area. And then if the answer to that is true, then it could very well expand, and you might be asked to review papers that lie outside your content area. So beyond sort of building that expertise, it's also important to sort of ask yourself another fair question: do you have time to do it? And when you lay out the timelines, it can range from 2 to 4 weeks. Nowadays, the pandemic might have stretched it out to it's more like we're expecting you to submit a review back, in like 3 to 6 weeks. Give a little more time. Can you fit that in your schedule, knowing full well that it's probably you sitting down, doing a review for a few hours time? And then how many of those can you do on a regular basis? And then, it's really less about how many of these you can do and how many of these you can do well and in a timely manner. I think the big one for a lot of us is thinking about whether or not we can give advice to people, even if the work conflicts with our own assumptions, our own preferences. It's natural to get papers like this. It's natural to have perspectives that conflict with other people. That's the way scholarship sort of functions. So then the question is, can you actually do that in a constructive fashion? Now, here's the very interesting thing when it comes to these editorial boards, and that's that editorial boards have lists of members, and they vary considerably as to how many reviews they actually do. So let's say it's a journal that draws value from readers based in part on who's on their editorial board. This is true for a lot of journals, particularly those that are still trying to gain notoriety in the field. They'll have folks on those editorial boards that are really there to demonstrate that they can get a really well-known person to say yes to being on the editorial board. And that person oftentimes won't review that many papers, if at all. And a lot of the work on the editorial board, even if it's a really big editorial board, is really done by a subset of members, of editorial board members, of ad hoc reviewers who have the time and can submit quality reviews. And so you might look at an editorial board and see several members on that board who do work similar to what you do. You might say to yourself, well, they already have people like me covered, and I wouldn't necessarily think that's the case. That said, if you have areas of expertise, particularly methodological expertise, that's not well represented on the board, being involved in reviewing activities and building your way up to being invited to get on the board becomes far more feasible or likely. And so, we're going to think about all these different kinds of aspects of reviewing behavior in all the different kinds of strategies that'll follow now. And we're going to sort of line up each of these kinds of strategies based on different kinds of career stages, so that we sort of talk about strategies that might very well connect with several of you who are here and who are watching the workshop on demand. Okay, so one of the key pieces of advice, one of the take-home messages that I want to sort of want you to take home from our time together today is that the strategies that we're going to be talking about are really relevant to any point in anyone's career. From maybe if you're a graduate student who's put out a paper or two already, there will be a strategy in here that of relevance to you. If you've already graduated and you're starting your academic career, independent academic career, and you want to get more involved in reviewing, we're going to have strategies there for you, and then beyond that. So we're going to try to hit on various time points in people's careers. And so the hope is that some of the work we're talking about here will be relevant to you regardless of which career stage you're in, but this also hopefully winds up being a resource you can turn back to when you get to a point in your career when it's time for the next thing to work on. And the reason why I think about this by career stage isn't necessarily that certain things are restricted to certain career stages. Far from it. It's really more that, by thinking about these strategies in reference to career stages, we can talk about getting involved in reviewing, getting involved in leadership in a way that seems manageable, seems feasible, seems doable, regardless of where you are in your career. And so let's say you're at that point in your career where you say to yourself, I probably haven't built the record that would make me competitive for inclusion in an editorial board, but I at least want to get involved with journals that I've read, that I've contributed to, that I've consumed for a period of time, but I have yet to review for them. How do you go about doing that? About as straightforward as you might think. Editors are always looking for new reviewers, always looking for people who have an area of expertise that's of relevance to the work that we do. And so in the Dropbox folder, there's a little template that I use that's on this screen here, and it's just really as simple as sending a quick email to an editor, attaching your CV and saying, if you need anybody, just keep me in mind. And usually that'll involve the editor sort of entering you into the system and then inviting you once they get a paper up your alley. Now, let's say you get invited by a journal, and you see a few review invites. You do them. You turn them in a timely basis. You do what appear to be good quality reviews because they keep on asking you. You know, in that time, an editor starts learning about how valuable you are, that you turn in high quality reviews, you're conscientious, you're the kind of reviewer they want to keep. And so when an editor sees an email like this, where we're hearing from a reviewer, I've done a few reviews, yeah, I really like the journal, I'm hoping that there's a possibility of being involved in the editorial board. I know you get a lot of these requests. I'm just asking. The worst that the editor will do is decline the request or not invite you. But a lot of editors see an email like this. You know what they say to themselves? If I say no, they're going to stop saying yes. Why should they keep on saying yes? And I think one of the key things to keep in mind with these requests is that they're more and more reasonable on your side as you start looking at editorial boards and you notice some key characteristics. So, like I mentioned before, not all editorial boards are created equal. So, one of the things I've always liked about the editorial board at the journal that I edit, the Journal of Clinical Child and Adolescent Psychology, JCAP, is that there's a strong history in the editorial boards of including members that vary considerably across career stages. You have everyone from endowed professors to sometimes graduate students. One of my first editorial board invitations came from JCAP while I was still a grad student. One of our address givers this year at the forum, Jessica Schleider, one of her first editorial board assignments was JCAP while she was still a grad student. I invited her. The journal has a long history of involving folks across career stages, in part because we know that editorial board members and their value can come at any career stage. But not all journals are like that. The more you see those characteristics embedded in a journal that you review, the more likely it's the case that when you've reviewed a few more times, you'll feel comfortable doing this. You'll be comfortable sort of inviting us. So if you see people in your career stage, in your content area reflected on the editorial board, that should give you a signal that if you do good work in that space, you do a series of reviews, you say yes to the reviews, you're conscientious about the reviews, and they're of good quality, then there's nothing keeping you. After, say, 3 to 5 reviews in a 12-month period for that journal. After about, when you're doing that amount at a journal, maybe an editorial member would do a little more than that in a year, depending on the needs of the journal. But by that point, the journal, the editors are kind of treating you as an editorial member, and so that should send a signal of, well, maybe I should at least ask. And if they say no, then that'll inform my decision as to whether or not I keep on reviewing for them. So you get on an editorial board, you're involved. It's a little more work than an ad hoc reviewer usually, but after a while you start getting a sense of what being involved in leadership is like. And here's another step up from that, because when you join that editorial board, you have an area of expertise. People know you for a certain thing. Your work has value in a particular content area. And maybe you might say to yourself, well, how can I do more of that? And it's not quite the same kind of heavy lifting as going above and beyond an editorial consultant and more like an associate editor-in-chief. Well, one of the ways in which people get more involved in journal editing is by serving in a guest editor capacity for a collection of papers in that journal, special issue, special section, something like that. And, you know, I've always found these to be really valuable experiences across career stages, and in particular, early on in your career. Because, you know, when you start doing work in an area and you build a record in that area, you build a record you have content area expertise, you typically get to a space where you sort of say to yourself, I think I have a good idea about what the next 5 or 10 or 15 years in this area should look like. And I know this in part because I do a lot of work in this area, but I also have a lot of colleagues who do similar work. And so that might be a time in your career. And this, again, you know, I did my first one of these not long after I joined the faculty in Maryland. So I started thinking about my first of these guest editor positions in 2008. The guest editing sort of issue that came out in 2011, and you know, the QR code here provides some examples and different kinds of materials you can use. And the reason why I wanted to do that, the reason why that's available to you, is because this is one of those pieces of editorial work that people are oftentimes are quite confused by. How do you go about doing one of these special issues? How do you go, you know, what's the process of getting to a point where you can guest edit an issue? And that's another dirty little secret, that most of these editorial, these guest editor scenarios pop up simply because a researcher, you know, sent a message to the editor-in-chief and said, I have an idea for a special issue. Maybe the journal's never done one of these before. This is like the first of its kind for this issue. Would you be interested in hearing more? And that's usually a space where the editor says, yeah, I'd like to hear some more. At a lot of journals, and this is definitely true of JCAP, but I think it's true of a lot of other journals, a lot of times editors use the special issue format because they have a sense that they want to cover an area, they want to publish more work in a content area that historically the journal hasn't covered. So special issues are a great place to, in a highly visible way, tell readers, we value work in this space, we want more work in this space, we want you to submit more papers in this space. And here's a clear example of that. We're going to dedicate an entire issue to this topic, right? So a really good example of this was, you know, several years ago, this was 2017, I believe, JCAP put out a special issue on sleep and mental health. That was guest edited by Lisa Meltzer. And one of the key reasons for why we put that issue out, this is when Mitch Prinstein was the editor, was that Dr. Prinstein was in the audience at a conference where Dr. Meltzer was giving a talk about sleep and developmental psychopathology. And she said, isn't it, and this was a conference that interfaced a whole lot with JCAP. Dr. Meltzer said, isn't it interesting that there are all these connections between sleep and mental health, and you know, there isn't a whole lot of work published in JCAP on these issues. And then from the way the way Dr. Prinstein told it, after the meeting, after the address was done, he sprinted down to the front of the stage and asked Dr. Meltzer, would you please do a special issue for JCAP on this? The rest is history. Is that and now fast forward all these years later, JCAP gets a ton of papers now on sleep and mental health, and we continue to do so because it's really important, innovative work. So guest editing is really useful. It's useful from the journal standpoint. And for those guest editors who really enjoy doing the work, because, you know, doing this, you're essentially serving the role. You're identifying the reviewers, you're identifying the contributors, you're doing a lot of really useful things. You're doing all the things an editor would do for an issue. And the reason why that's important is that from a career development standpoint, if you like guest editing and you want to do more of it, well, it turns out that guest editing winds up being a place where a lot of editors look to see, is this the kind of person that I think would do a good job in a permanent capacity as an associate editor on my team. At a lot of these journals, they get so many submissions that beyond the editor-in-chief, there's also a series of associate editors with content area expertise and methodological expertise that often varies from the editor-in-chief. Right? So editors, when they look to build their editorial board and they look to identify not only editorial consultants, but associate editors, will often look to recent guest edited special issues to ask the question, is that the kind of person we might want to have as an associate editor on our board? And sometimes the editors will just reach out to you. It's like, hey, I saw the work that you did there. I think it's great. Do you want to do more of it as an associate editor? I'd love to talk with you more about how to go about joining our board in that way. And some journals will actually put out position announcements. We're looking for associate editors, on this journal, at this journal. So you see that too. You see that as well. Usually through a combination of associate editor positions, guest editor positions, someone starts thinking, well, maybe I'd like to serve in this kind of editor-in-chief capacity. And those are almost always open call announcements where we're looking for the next editor-in-chief of such and such journal. And those scenarios where you put your hat in the ring to be nominated to be editor-in-chief of the journal have a bunch of moving parts that don't look that much different than a job application. A CV, a cover letter, a list of references who will submit letters of recommendation on your behalf, and a personal statement. And it's less about a statement of your own work and more about where you'd like to take the journal, your vision for the journal if you were to assume the role as editor-in-chief. So those are all the ways in which you can be involved in leadership capacity at any one of the journals that you through which you consume research. Now, what I didn't talk about were some of the benefits, some of the things that are useful to consider in the context of your work in each of these kinds of capacities. We'll go sequentially, starting with ad hoc reviewing. I still do ad hoc reviews. I still review for journals where I'm not on the editorial board. I review for journals where I am on the editorial board. I handle reviews as editor of JCAP. All that work, and especially the work in the ad hoc space, I tend to see as some of the best ways to improve your own writing. Also, some of the best ways to think about strategically how to respond to reviewer commentary. You see great examples of response to reviewer commentary. You see really bad examples and all things in between. And so they're great learning experiences. I tend to think that this is one of the best ways to improve your writing, to be involved in the review process and get a sense of different ways in which people communicate their science, communicate their scholarship, and then trying to figure out, are there things that could be useful there, strategies that I could use to improve the way that I write myself. Editorial consulting, you still get that benefit of ad hoc reviewing, the benefits that you get from seeing what it's like for people to write really good papers and not so good papers and respond to commentary in good ways and bad ways, in useful ways and in destructive ways. And from a consultant standpoint, being on the editorial board, you're doing more reviews than an ad hoc reviewer. But one of the big things, one of the big value adds with being an editorial consultant is that, and this is true as you start accruing more memberships and more journals, that people start equating seeing you on these boards with that person's expertise has value. And in some respects, that allocation of value to your work has a way of stretching beyond you and into the content area your work represents. And so in a lot of the work that my lab does, we focus a lot of our attention on assessment. I think that one of the key reasons why people, to the degree they see value in the work that our lab does, it stretches beyond the mere quality of the work, but also that there are tangible, concrete aspects of our work that extend beyond, X papers published per year, X papers published in that journal. That work is so valuable, it's being represented on the editorial boards of these journals. Whether people know it or not, I tend to think that this value extends out to thinking, oh, well, if that person who does work in that area is on these editorial boards, and that means that work has value. That content area has value, has currency. And that'll be a big thing that we talk about towards the end when we start thinking about or discussing some of the structural barriers in building that currency within content areas at many of our journals. Guest editing is really interesting. So, like I mentioned before, I tend to think of this work as being relevant across many career stages. You can do really great guest edited work early in your career, middle of your career, later on in your career. It really all depends on whether or not you see this moment as a really good time for you to think about collecting a series of papers that are of relevance to this area. I tend to think that when you guest edit a special issue in a well-respected journal, in a widely read journal, that it has some of the same kinds of benefits you might have if you publish a major review paper or meta-analysis in a big journal. I tend to think of them as having a similar kind of splash or impact. And the reason why that is that there are lots of ways to strategize within that special issue to optimize its impact in a way you can't do with one single paper. And so beyond seeking out contributions from scholars in an area, beyond publishing their work and disseminating, maybe it's high profile work that you want to be connected to, you're also tasked typically with these guest edited scenarios to prepare an introduction. So an introductory paper, this is what this issue is all about. And also seek out commentaries from scholars who do work in that area or related areas, and you want them to write a response paper in reaction to all the contributions in the series. And so the collection of all those things, the intro that you write, the commentaries you seek out, the actual contributions to the special issue, have a way of signaling that leadership capacity that I mentioned earlier before can often can accrue with just one really good review or meta-analysis in an area of study. But it goes beyond that, because the introduction paper, if you write it as a review paper, will be treated as a review paper by the rest of the field. And so one of my most highly cited papers in my own record is the introduction to the special section that I published in JCAP back in 2011. Part of the reason why that special section had the kind of impact that it had was because I sought out the commentary of Dr. Thomas Hockenbach, who developed the child behavior checklist and many other different kinds of inventories. fantastic scholar who did work in the area covered by that special section, was kind enough to write a really great commentary. And so the connection between not just the contributions, but the introduction paper and a commentary written by somebody who knows the area really well and is highly visible in it, had a way of raising the profile of the content covered in that issue in a way that can take the form of a really major review paper in an area of interest. And these guest editor spots, as I mentioned before, also often are the kind of place that editors will sort of see you as ready for these associate editor positions. Like the connection between ad hoc reviewing and editorial consulting, associate editor positions look a lot like guest editor positions, only they're not one-offs like a guest editing position would be, like not just one issue, but you're involved with a journal for a long period of time, usually several years. You also handle submissions throughout the year, and how many of those submissions you have depends on the journal and how many papers they get. The associate editors on a journal, they appear on the journal's masthead, the editorial board listing, just like the editor-in-chief and here is a place where editors-in-chief will be explicit in who they identify in terms of content area expertise. So as an example, JCAP's associate editor list has folks with expertise in autism, in culture and discrimination, in structural factors linked to mental health, sort of community level mental health, in developmental science and prevention, in neurobiology, in a host of different kinds of areas, in implementation science. So we think about these associate editor positions very concretely. Like we want somebody on the journal's editorial board, where someone who does work on autism says, okay, so Susan White is an associate editor here at JCAP. If I submit my autism paper to JCAP, I can be guaranteed that there will be at least somebody on the associate editor list who knows that content area well and can give me a fair review. And that's true of all the other sort of content areas. So if I do work on structural factors relevant to youth mental health, I know that Nani Gaylord-Hardin has extensive expertise in that area and can give me a fair review if I submit a paper there. So here's another place, because associated positions have to have that kind of content area expertise that spreads out across areas of relevance to the journal. This is another place where you can signal your expertise as value. And typically one of those necessary conditions for being considered for an editor-in-chief position is to have one or more of these associate editor experiences. The editor-in-chief position sort of encompasses all that work you saw from, all the other reviewing capacities that you saw that we've seen before. You're the one who builds the editorial board. You're the one who recruits the consultants, the associate editors. You look at that editorial board year in and year out and identify the people who should be added onto the board. This year I'm a little overdue in submitting invitations to folks, who we want to join the board. I'm hoping to get to that in a few days. And we're also tasked with seeking out ideas for work to do in relevant spaces. And in that respect, editors-in-chief play a big role in what a journal covers and what kind of content comes out in the journal year in and year out. I find the work immensely fulfilling because it doesn't engage you in the same way that your own work does. It's less about being a recording artist and more about being a music producer. Like journals, they're kind of like music labels. You can't release everybody's song. Not all songs fit your label, but every once in a while you get a really good song that fits the label, that's already in great shape when they submit it, but it needs a little work to really come out as a hit song. And that's kind of the way the editor sort of comes into it. That they're in that space thinking, this is a great paper. It's got lots of potential, and it needs a backup singer over here, some more percussion over there. The chorus could use some work, but after that, it's going to be really good. It's going to be a really good song. And music producers have to listen to a lot of music, and then editors in chief have to do a lot of reading, and in a good way, because I tend to think that I'm much better at this job, not just because I see submissions come into the journal that I can read and benefit from, in terms of it's a really great way of writing a paper like that. Like I'm gonna use that. I'm gonna think of that strategy going forward. It's also a way for you to stay up to date, particularly at a place like JCAP that gets so much variation in content. Because the sort of discipline of youth mental health is a pretty broad discipline, and so you by construction, being an editor-in-chief of a journal that covers this broad a terrain is a benefit in this way. Many different ways, but this is one of the big ways. You're able to stay up to date. I'm going to round off our discussion here with a sort of a sense of, well, what are, if you're interested in getting these kinds of experiences, what are some of the challenges with getting these experiences? Beyond the fact that it's really hard to build the record in your own area, to then on top of that build out an area of expertise in relation to journal leadership, it's already tough to do those things. They're huge time commitments. But in addition to that, you've probably also noticed that journals vary on how much coverage they give to content areas you care about. It's probably not a function of, well, there aren't people doing good work in that area. It's probably not also, well, people don't really want to read that work. It's, usually with a journal and its editorial board, it's a function oftentimes of disparities in who has positions of leadership at these journals. There's a paper that's in the Dropbox folder that I think is required reading for all people doing scholarship, especially in psychology, but I think in general. It's a really great meta-analytic review written by Stephen Roberts and colleagues. It's published in Perspectives in Psychological Science. And it, across several decades of work, across various subdisciplines in psychology, shows in concrete terms how homogeneous the editorial boards have been over the expanse of decades across these journals. Now, these were all journals published in cognitive, developmental, and social, but I can tell you my own sense is that I don't think that the numbers are all that better in more applied subdisciplines of psychology. Now, like I mentioned before, editorial boards are both scientific and moral documents. And so in this key respect, when you see this little heterogeneity on the editorial board of a given journal, that also has a way of impacting the degree to which the rest of the scholarly community thinks of topics that aren't covered. One of the key things about the Roberts paper is that the journals that were being examined there, many of them were considered what we call sort of mainstream journals that cover broad content areas in the field. They're not specialty journals that focus on a specific content area. And so when a mainstream journal doesn't make space on the board for a given content area, that might also be seen by the rest of the scholarly community as that content area has yet to earn the right to have, or the privilege to have, attention or visibility in a mainstream journal. That's huge. And it has huge impacts on the coverage and value placed on work revolving around issues surrounding equity, diversity, and inclusion. Roberts here makes that really clear. It shouldn't come as much as a surprise to any of us. The homogeneity and composition of these editorial boards correlates with core features of the work. The content area of research, the participants in the research, and even the authors of the research all appear to be related to the degree to which a journal has a homogeneous composition on its editorial board. Now, how do you overcome this? How do you dismantle these patterns? How do you make journals more heterogeneous? There's probably no one way to do this. There are a variety of strategies that'll likely help. If you see yourself doing work in these spaces and you want more coverage of these spaces on the editorial boards, reaching out to be someone who does ad hoc reviewing is one way to do it. If a journal, after doing a few reviews, the journal, if you advocate for yourself to be included in the editorial board and the journal says actually no, there's nothing keeping you from just declining reviews of that journal and just taking your skills to another journal that might find value in your work. When you're ready to do so, proposing a special issue in your content area to raise the currency of that content area and perhaps even increase representation of that content area in a journal that historically hasn't covered it. And then, if you see journal editors at conferences, what's keeping you at the journal from getting work in these areas? And that can happen at conferences, it can happen over email, it can happen over social media. Now you might say to yourself, some of this stuff looks difficult to change, and some of it is. Here's one of the things that facilitates making these changes. That at most journals, or at all journals that I can think of, editors-in-chief are all compensated for their time. At many journals, not all journals, associate editors are compensated for their time. In my experience, I've yet to encounter one that compensates editorial consultants for their time and ad hoc reviewers not for their time as well. And what that means is that a sizable chunk of these editorial boards, their composition can change in a very short period of time. So several years ago, it's one example, I looked at the composition of our editorial board at JCAP after reading the Roberts paper and realizing, JCAP's not doing much better than what we're seeing at these other journals. How do we change that? And so I worked with my team to put together an invitation that made clear to the folks who we were inviting, we have an unacceptably low level of expertise in our journal on issues relevant to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and their links to youth mental health. We want to change that. We want to change it for the long term. We'd like you to join the editorial board, and we're going to try our best to make the commitment that you have to this journal as minimal as possible, because we understand that individuals who do work in these spaces are oftentimes attacked for their time in the way of service in many other spaces beyond just serving on editorial boards. So we tried to make it clear that where our conceptual framework was coming from with regards to making invitations was the editorial boards of journals are ways in which journals can share power, can give power to and currency to content areas by increasing their representation. As a consequence of that, if you look at the editorial board of JCAP now and look at the areas of content areas of representatives of editorial board members, at least consultants, what you'll see is that, broadly speaking, when you think about broad categories, anxiety, ADHD, chronic problems, what have you, these issues relevant to diversity are essentially the most well-represented element of our board now. Here's a table of the folks we invited back in 2020, and we've increased coverage since then. These are all invites we made overnight. Because these elements of our work, this core component of our work can be, is done on a pro bono basis. It doesn't cost the publisher anything for us to say to ourselves, let's change the structure of the editorial board in at least this way. And the society that runs JCAP, SCAP, was accommodating in ways that ran beyond the editorial consultants. In around this same time point, I advocated for adding an extra associate editor line in our budget to bring on Lenny Gaylord Hardin after we already recruited Jose Diaz, who does really great work in cultural discrimination, because I knew that with recruiting Jose, we were able to get coverage in discrimination and culture as it relates in that interpersonal space. But it'd be great to also get someone who's steeped in the literature on structures and communities, of which Dr. Gaylord Hardin has considerable expertise. So I asked the society, would you give me the extra money in the budget to bring on this person, to recruit a scholar in this space? They said yes, and then we looked around for folks who'd be willing and able to do it, and thankfully Dr. Gaylord Hardin said yes, and she's still with us. Does really great work, and so these some of these changes took some resources, some of them didn't, and that's something editors can do, but that kind of work really can't manifest unless we also get people who are willing to serve in those leadership capacities over time, who have this idea that we need to change these structures, we need to dismantle them, we need to rebuild them in a more diverse and equitable way. And that's what I hope anyone who listens to this workshop takes from this, that these barriers can't change, they can't be rebuilt in the image of the discipline. Without new leadership, people willing to engage in these leadership roles. All right, so that's all that I have for today. We still have time for some questions. I welcome any comments or questions you might have. All right, great. Well, thank you all for your time. We'll have an address. We'll have an address tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern time. Looking forward to seeing you all then. And take care.